We have Melissa Appel, Associate Director of Product at Wayfair, here to cover interview questions, best practices. So everybody, please give her a silent hand and keep your microphones on mute. Any questions you may have during the session, please pop them into chat. We will have 10 minutes for Q&A after. Thank you. Welcome, Melissa.
Hello. Thank you. It is weird to be talking to an audience where I only see a bunch of squares with people's names in them, but that's okay. I'm Melissa Appel. I work at Wayfair, and I'm going to talk about interview questions, best practices. And just to confirm, this is not like going in a job interview. This is interviewing customers and how you ask them questions that you're going to actually get answers that are usable. Thank you to the sponsors. Good to be here. So I want to start with why would you want to ask questions? Maybe it's obvious, but there are a bunch of reasons why you might want to go and ask people a bunch of questions, right? You want to find patterns, you want to develop personas, you want to understand a problem, you want to evaluate possible solutions, right? Validate a hypothesis, learn about a process, identify opportunities, understand barriers to adoption, lots of other reasons why you would want to ask questions. And so the problem is that the way you ask the question can influence the answer. So you want to make sure you're asking questions that are going to get you the responses that you want. And there's a whole bunch of tips and tricks that I've learned over the years that I'm going to share with you. So this week I went to visit I work at Wayfair. I work in the warehousing group, fulfillment centers. And so my team designs the products and tools and processes that the folks use in the warehouses, associates and supervisors to do their job. So this week I got an opportunity to go and visit a warehouse for the first time in a year and a half, which is amazing because I'm fully vaccinated and that's awesome. I took my whole team with me because everybody's vaccinated, met people I hadn't even met in person for the first time. So it was all really, really cool. I'm going to tell you all about it, but first I'm going to do a pop quiz. I know I haven't covered any content yet, but bear with me, all right? I'm going to ask a bunch of questions, and there's going to be A or B, and I want you guys to just sort of throw your answer in the chat, all right? So, which of these questions is better? A, do you think the reorganization is good or bad? B, what do you think will be the impact of your reorganization? Okay, pretty unanimous here. All right, ask open-ended questions, right? I think that one's pretty clear. Good, you guys all get a point. What did you do with the document once you exported it? And did you use the document after you exported it? Okay, mostly A is in there. Right, don't ask yes or no questions. Sometimes it's appropriate, but usually only with a follow-up. A, how many times do you expect to use this report in the next 6 months? B, how often have you used this report in the past 6 months? You guys are good. Okay. Yeah, past behavior is the best indicator of future behavior. You know, don't ask people to predict the future necessarily. The last time you used this feature, what did you do with it? B, think about the last time you used this feature. Take me through your process from start to finish. Yeah, both questions are good, but if you can put them in the right mindset, either through how you word the question or in the questions you've asked previously, they can usually provide more details and more interesting insights if they're in that headspace of doing it. The best thing to do is asking them about it while they're actually using the feature. But if you don't have that opportunity, at least kind of put them in the mindset. All right, did your boss ask for additional information? Tell me about any additional information your boss asked for. All right, this was sort of a trick question. You might need to ask both, right? You might need to ask a yes or no question because you don't want to make assumptions. Sometimes if you just ask somebody hey, what did your boss ask you about after you sent it to them? Maybe they didn't send it to their boss. Maybe the boss didn't ask any questions, but they might answer your question anyway because they want to sound intelligent or whatnot. So sometimes you just have to like ask the obvious questions to double check. What do you think about climate change? Is A. B is, what have you done recently to prevent climate change? So this is sort of like asking them to back up their opinions, but like, don't ask this question because it sounds preachy or judgy, right? But the idea is that like, you know, hey, you know, would you use this feature? Like, what do you think about the feature? Oh, well, would you actually use it? Have you used it? Right? Those kinds of things. A, how do you feel about all that paperwork? B, how do your coworkers feel about all that paperwork? So this one's about like mind reading, right? You might ask how their coworkers feel just to get a sense of the culture, but like they might not know. A, how might you use a monthly reporting feature? And B, how do you currently communicate periodic updates? Yeah. Don't get specific if you don't have to. Ask about, you know, what they're trying to do, potentially, rather than asking about a specific solution, unless you actually want to see what they would do with a specific solution. And the answer to A might be like, I wouldn't, which is also interesting. But you might also want to ask B to say like, well, you know, do you actually communicate updates? If so, how do you do it? They might say, oh, I use the phone, or I do it in my one-on-one, right? And then you can have more information there. Okay, so which question order is better? A, who do you normally give the report to, and what is the purpose of the report? B, what is the purpose of the report, and who do you normally give the report to? A lot of people saying B. Another trick question. You may also have to ask things multiple times, right? You may say like, is there anybody else that you give the report to? What is the purpose of that handoff, that communication? So, you know, B is good because it puts them in the mindset of like, what's this report for? And A is good because it puts them in the mindset of like, well, what are you actually doing? Who are you giving it to and what they're doing with it? So good job, everybody. So what makes a good question? I went over a few of the answers here, but you know, open-ended, avoid leading or biased questions, and you know, don't ask them necessarily what other people think, or at least don't pin your you know, solutions on what they say there. You can ask them for a walkthrough, ask about action, maybe in addition to opinions. Ask whys, right? There's the idea of like the 5 whys. You don't just go like why, but you know, you ask follow up like, oh, why do you do that? Oh, why is that interesting, right? Like, what do you do about that? You want to ask for examples and use probes, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And then like be intentional. If you're writing up like an interview guide or something, like make sure you're including questions that have a purpose, like figure out what you want to get out of it. Make the questions clear and concise, right? Like the fewer questions, the better. Like what is the root of what you want to get out of this conversation? And also questions must be answerable because people will try to answer anything, right? Make sure that what you're asking them about is actually part of their job or their task that they're trying to complete, and not necessarily something that they just think they know about. So for probing questions, these are like, you know, how to get more information, right? Some people will just give you a yes or no, or a, yeah, it's okay, right? And they won't expand. So asking for examples is sometimes good, or if they use some of these words like confusing, annoying, difficult, like what do you mean by that, right? You can ask about feelings or motivations. What was the goal? Why do you do it that way? You know, why is that important? You can also clarify the question, although I wouldn't necessarily just jump to that. Like if they're confused or they don't really know what you're talking about, you could give an example. And then also kind of the more details questions, right? Tell me more about that. It sounds like you just said, blah, is that right? Or can you give me more details? Can you give me an example? Tell me about the last time that happened. A question I usually like to ask is there anything else that you want to tell me about? And if you're writing up like an interview guide, then you can write the probes directly in there if that's helpful. Active listening is key. A lot of times just restating, summarizing, empathizing is really helpful to like get them on your side. Sometimes even just saying, wow, that must be really annoying, right? Gets them to keep talking. Because you're expressing that like you get them, you understand what they're trying to say. And then, you know, a lot of times, especially if you're like testing out a product or something like that, that they'll ask you about it. They'll ask how it works or how it does it. And you want to like go psychologist on them and say like, how do you want the feature to work, right? What would you expect to happen? And that gives you a lot more information than just kind of answering the questions about how it works right now. A lot of times, you know, if you're asking, especially if you're asking about feedback on a product or something like that, right? You want to stress that there's no right or wrong answers. It's okay if you don't know the answer, just to kind of put people at ease. And then the last thing is really like embrace silence. Let the person answer. Sometimes there's some people who just need to think about it for a little while, right? And so sometimes just letting them think about it, that they'll come up with an answer. The probes help too. So I'm going to get back to, actually, are there any questions on that stuff so far? All right. I'm going to get back to my warehouse visit, which was awesome. And this was, the goal of this visit was partially just because I hadn't been out in the field in a year and a half, and I really wanted to go and see how people are doing things. And part of it was that there were just certain processes that I wanted to learn more about. I didn't necessarily have a particular goal. I had a couple of topics that I wanted to ask about. It was very much a kind of exploratory kind of visit, just to kind of set the stage. So I went out and I saw stuff and I asked about it, right? Like, what do the cones mean? How does somebody know when to use a cone or not use a cone and what to do about it? And this got into, you know, a whole conversation about what they are and what they're used, what they like about it, what they don't like about it, some ideas, right? And so just kind of starting off with some open-ended questions can sometimes be really helpful. Why are the blue boxes falling over? Why only the blue boxes? The answer here was actually that they were rolled mattresses, and it was Georgia and it was really humid, and so like they fell over. But there's nothing wrong with the product inside. But it was interesting because it was just sort of something I noticed. And once I started asking about it, it talked a little bit about, you know, the process and inspection and things like that. So it became a really interesting conversation. How do you use the stickers? Why are they different colors, right? I think curiosity is huge especially when you're on site or visiting somebody during something that they're doing, to just kind of ask questions and figure out what's going on. Why do you need a paper list? Like, we gave you software. Why are you writing things down on paper? How do you use it? What does it give you that the software doesn't? And, you know, these are the kind of questions that like I might not know to ask if I didn't even know they use paper. Also a reason why going and asking people questions in context is super helpful. So this is actually, this is a different topic, right? So we went to the warehouse, really awesome visit. There's also times when like you're talking with a stakeholder and you want to ask questions. I work on internal products. So my stakeholders are within my company, our operations group. And so sometimes you got to like dig in and figure out what the problem is. And so, you know, these are names have been changed, but Bob came to me with a topic that he wanted to ask about. And he said, We have a lack of a web terminal for our mobile scanner. That's the problem statement that he came to me with. And I'm not really sure what he's talking about. So I'm going to ask him some questions, right? Like, what do you mean by web terminal? Do you mean that you want the mobile scanner function on a computer screen instead of on the mobile device? And he says, yes. I'm like, okay, I need to know more about this, right? So it sounds like you want the ability to do inventory adjustments on a computer. And then he gets into more of the like, okay, what is a web terminal? He's like, I don't know what it is, but that's what the sites call it. We used to have one that was helpful when you needed to copy and paste control numbers. Okay, now I have additional information. There's something about control numbers and something about copying and pasting. So I said, I think I need to know more about what the workflow looks like. So he says, you scan something with the mobile scanner, and then you go on the computer and you type something into the mobile scanner from the computer. Okay, so that's why he wants the mobile scanner interface on the computer so you can copy and paste back and forth. So like manually copying numbers is definitely bad. But I said, well, maybe we can just allow them to scan something on the computer with the mobile device to copy the numbers onto the mobile device. So I also said, like, what's this control number thing? So he sends me a screenshot of a table, and one column says control number. It's just like a bunch of numbers. I'm like, I have no idea what this is. So I said, why does the person doing the adjustment need to know the control number? And you can see the answer. When you do an inventory adjustment, you need to know the control number. That's not helpful, right? So I asked the question again, why do you need to know the control number? He said, I don't know much about that world. I'll follow up. And my first thought is like, if it's hard to copy over the control number, maybe we just stop using the control number and then there's nothing to copy. So then he asked some people, he came back and he says, it's a finance team requirement. The control number is required. I still don't know anything else, right? So like, I still don't know what the control number is, but I do know that it sounds like the problem is that we need to enable a person to do this process without manual data entry, okay? So now, like, I've gone through this whole thing. I don't really necessarily know much more about it, but I think I've at least identified what the problem is, and that's a good starting point. Any questions? I probably spoke too fast because I tend to do that, but any questions, any like situations that you've had where you've had to ask questions or you're not sure if you got what you intended to get out of it? Has anybody had these situations come up on your own?
You may post your questions into chat, or you can try the raise your hand function on Zoom, although that's a little squirrely. Eugene Barles has a question. Eugene, go ahead. I'll unmute you.
Hi, thank you. So I've been getting a lot. I work as a global product manager for a capital company, and we do a lot of interviews of a lot of both technical people, but very senior technical people. And we're getting a lot of pushback when we start asking them questions that might take them 20 minutes to answer. We'll go offline, we'll give them 20 minutes, we'll come back and see what they have. Mm-hmm. A lot of pushback on higher level people when we do this. Developers like it because they can show their creativity. Comments, suggestions?
So I'll start with a question. Why are you asking them such detailed questions that they need 20 minutes to answer?
They're not detailed, but when I went to management school, I had case method, and we give them a case, and we like to give them a little while to think about it. We give them enough detail so they can think about it, but enough that they can make stuff up. We're trying to see creativity, and quite honestly, we're trying to get some stuff that's just not on a resume and not on a LinkedIn profile.
Okay, so you're talking about interview questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know that I can necessarily comment on that. That's probably more like what your interview process is like. My expertise is more in customer questions for like user research.
Fair enough.
So I'm not sure I can answer your question.
Okay.
All right. Next question came from Shelby. What were your next steps? Did you keep going after the control number, or did it branch off to something else?
Yeah. So this was just last week, and I haven't had a chance to follow up yet. But I sent him to somebody else who had more context on the adjustment process that he was trying to go through. But the next step would be, what is this control number? And honestly, it's still a mystery to me, but it's something I want to follow up on.
Okay. And Shelby raised her hand too. Shelby, if you want to follow up on that, you can.
Yeah, I was going to say, thank you for the response. I think that I get a lot of these sort of situations. We have a very complicated business process, and there's lots of roles that are like, it's just always been that way, and just trying to dig into like, but does it have to be that way? And I think that that's kind of the challenge of like, how do you know when to keep pushing, or like, like how does that lead forward? What if the answer doesn't actually land with your team? Like, how do you handle, we found the problem and it's not actually in my area of responsibility? Is it just coordination? I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think there were two questions. One was, how do you approach a situation where somebody says, this is just how we have always done it? And the second one is, what do you do if it's not your problem? So the first question, I usually try to figure out like, who taught you how to do this, and like work my way up through the people and try to get at like the person who designed the process, who's not even always still at the company. But usually I can get far enough up the chain to figure out like why they're doing the process. A lot of times it just is like, this is the way we've always done it. But luckily as product people, we're usually in a position to say like, all right, well, what if we did it this other way? And so that's usually where I'll try to like figure out where it came from and who's in charge, and ask them. So like that goes back to like, the person you're talking to might not always be able to answer the question. So sometimes you need to find the person who is able to answer the question.
All right. And
the second question was, what do I do if it's not in my topic area? I really like it when other teams come to me with problems that might be in my area. That's how you sort of do knowledge sharing. And as long as the culture at your company is open to that, and maybe you can start it, say like, hey, I met this person, they had this really interesting idea, I think it fits in your wheelhouse, do you want me to make an introduction? Or like, here are my notes.
Awesome, thank you, I appreciate it.
And Michael asks, when you go on site, do you bring a preset list of questions? And if so, what format? How do you record your answers?
Yeah, good question. So it depends, I think, in what stage of the kind of research you are in. If you're just generally exploratory, like I want to learn more about this process, sometimes I'll bring a set of questions, sometimes I won't. Sometimes I'll, write a set of questions on my way over. I think if you're in an industry where like the person you're interviewing is sitting at a desk and doing a thing, it's easier to bring like a set of questions with you. Or if you're on the phone, right, it's easier to write out a set of questions. In my case, I'm like walking around a 1 million square foot warehouse. So it's hard to like kind of juggle things. Personally, I record the answers by taking notes in a little notebook. I have like a small size notebook that I bring with me. Just over the years, I've learned how to like write and talk and walk at the same time, but it's not always easy for people. If you have more than one person, you can have one person asking the questions and one person taking the notes. If the person that you're interviewing is okay recording it, then that's usually helpful and you can go back later. But I usually write pen and paper personally.
Great. Charles asks, well, actually says, this has been really great, Melissa, and then asks, what do you think is the greatest benefit habitual interviewing has brought to your team?
I think it's gotten rid of the I think in meetings, right? So if you have an idea for a product or a feature and you can say, hey, this is what I've heard from talking to people, or here's a quote, or here's a picture, then it has a lot more sway than just saying, I think people would want this, right? And so if you're trying to prioritize what you're working on, if you're trying to get resources, if you're trying to get executive buy-in, then this interviewing process, right, like going out and asking people, is usually the best evidence, I think, that you can bring for that.
Great. And Michelle asks, Mitchell asks, how would you handle a chatty Cathy situation? We've had some interviewers that often get excited when responding to questions. How do we limit the responses to keep the interview moving?
That's a good question. So sometimes you might say, that's really interesting. Can I ask you about this? Or sometimes, if you find that somebody's just talking and talking and talking, it is hard to interrupt, but sometimes you can just say, can I interrupt you for a second? Because I really want to know about this other thing. It's not always easy. And then sometimes if you do get a chance to like pop in and say something, sometimes you can say like, hey, I know we have limited time. I just have a couple more questions. I'm wondering if, I have 3 more questions to get to, here are all the questions potentially, so they know what's going on. But sometimes you have an interview that you just have to throw away, honestly, because you didn't get useful information. Either they were too talkative or not talkative enough. So having multiple interviews set up is usually pretty helpful too.
Cool. And Michelle asks, how would the line of questioning differ for a new product that somebody hasn't used? I worry we'll tend to use too many fortune-telling type questions of how they might use something.
Yeah, so it depends. Usually a new product is replacing an old process or product, right? It might not be like a one-for-one new product, old product, but if the person is trying to accomplish the task, if they're not trying to do it at all, then maybe it's difficult, but you can ask about, here's the goal of my product. How do you currently accomplish that goal, right? I always find that, the biggest competitors are Excel or Google Sheets and like do nothing. So sometimes if you get people who are like, I wouldn't use it, I don't know how to use it, you can go back to like, well, what do you do today? Or do you have this goal even? And figure out if they're even the right person to talk to. But one of the pop quiz questions that I asked was like, how would you use a reporting feature versus how do you communicate periodic updates today? So you can ask questions about how they do the thing, even if they don't even have any sort of tool to do it with today. Does that help? Hopefully.
Yeah, and says, yeah. So we have got a question that's backed up by another person. What are your next steps after doing an interview? How do you analyze the results and convert them into decisions about features?
Yeah, good question. So a lot of times we'll do, like if there's multiple people, doing the interview or on the site visit, we'll do a debrief afterwards. A lot of times it's, I'll type up my notes and I'll try to like find patterns, right? So if you try to like summarize what you've learned, that's usually helpful. Just the process of going through and summarizing it helps you kind of dig out the key insights. If you've done a lot of interviews, sometimes what I'll do is either maybe they're already typed out or type them out or have them transcribed. There's some transcription services that I don't remember the names of anymore that can do it for fairly cheap. And then I literally print it out. I cut out pieces of the interview and I put them on a giant table and I like reorganize them into groupings to try to find the patterns in what I've been learning. And if a bunch of people have done similar interviews on the same topic, you can pull everything together and get together as a group, either physical or virtual Miro boards or whatever are really helpful, and just sort of see if you can find some patterns and find some conclusions there.
We still have about 5 minutes left if we have any other questions or follow-ups. I'll throw one. This goes back to the question on decisions about features. when we're trying to kind of map out commonalities and look for segments or different personas within the things, what are your general heuristics to kind of divide groups into subgroups? How do you know when something is different enough it might need to be considered a different persona or a segment?
Yeah, I think it's a little more of an art than a science. I'm a big fan of Post-it notes. I'm working at home. I don't have a whiteboard. I don't really have a big wall. I took a bunch of Post-it notes and put them like on the kitchen table and like move them around. And if you have multiple people, that's also helpful. We use Miro a lot, which has like virtual sticky notes. But you try some things out, see if it makes sense, pressure test it. You can say like, hey, these two personas or groups kind of feel the same. Are they the same? Does that make sense? Or should they be different? And just kind of asking those questions, I think.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Question.
Julie asks, you mentioned keeping to a small number of questions. Do you have guidelines or suggestions for how many questions to plan for in a 30-minute versus 1-hour interview?
I don't know that there's necessarily a guideline. What I do, like in situations where I write out an interview guide, I try to ask the most important questions first, make sure I get to them. But I also like highlight things that I don't want to skip. It also, if you get like a chatty Cathy, then you're not going to get through as much. I always try to have extra questions that I can ask if I run out of time. But I think in a 30-minute interview, I don't know, like 5 or 6 questions. It depends what the scope of the questions are, right? And things like what's your role and what's your team look like? Those don't count as questions in my head. That's just sort of like background information.